So, I recently came across this relic, Official Nintendo Magazine issue 12 for January 2007, and I was immediately enamoured. I was an active reader of Nintendo Power's British cousin from around 2010 to 2013, so this was well before my time, but it is from the era I was getting into gaming. What attracted me most to this issue in particular is the collage of mismatching renders paired with a bold statement of why Nintendo owns 2007. Amidst reviews for games like WarioWare Smooth Moves, detailed guides for Twilight Princess, and news stories on the successful launch of the Wii the previous month is a cover feature promising to reveal the 50 Wii and DS games that will rock your world. This confident claim, for whatever reason, hooked me. Sure, I could just look at Nintendo's sales figures for the year and be done with it, but I want to know which 50 games supposedly releasing in 2007 this group of gaming journalists thought would result in annual Nintendo domination, and I want to see if they were right. There's bound to be some games here which are now regarded classics, dare I say retro gems, and there are others which have dwindled into complete obscurity. Many were delayed well past 2007, some never localized, and a couple cancelled completely. Both the Wii and the DS were home to tons of games, so I'm guaranteed to have not heard of a few of these. Either way, I want to look at all 50 of them, play as many as I can get my hands on, and see how much they eventually contributed to the gaming giant's overall ownage of the year. So, how did they start? Yeah, there's a good chance you're familiar with Mario Galaxy. When talking about the game's legacy and as a source of general opinions, I'm going to be using the more mainstream Metacritic and the more niche Backlogged, since I think that gives me a good overall image. Not only is Mario Galaxy the highest rated Wii game from 2007 on both of these platforms, it's also the highest rated original game from 2007 overall, and also the highest rated original Wii game from its entire library. While O&M expected Galaxy to be on shelves by spring of 2007, it didn't release worldwide until November, but it's safe to say it was well worth the wait. It's easy to gush about Mario Galaxy, since while I'm sure it has a minority of detractors, it's one of the most beloved games of the century for a reason, defining its generation, platform and genre, and for me personally, out of the massive pool of options, it's both my favourite 3D platformer and Mario game. For most people, when you say cozy game, some amalgamation of Animal Crossing or Stardew Valley comes to mind, but for me, it's flying around the Comet Observatory in Mario Galaxy. After just playing the demo, the author of the feature, who isn't cited specifically anywhere in the issue, so I'm just going to call whoever it is from this lineup O&M, could tell it was shaping up to be momentous, and they were on the money. But out of all the information about the then upcoming title they included, what I find the most interesting is a tinge of insecurity that seeps through at the beginning.
Now that the Wii's out and most of you are stuck into Twilight Princess, it should be clear that the console is capable of producing beautiful, proper games and isn't just a gimmick.
So early in the Wii's life, you can already see the first stages of the uphill battle Wii defenders were fighting to prove that the console was more than its strange controller. Amidst the hype for what would go on to be a once-in-a-lifetime game, they decided to start the whole thing off on the defensive. And it's a shame that this stigma still sticks with the console to this day, thanks to just how combative these discussions about it were. Either way, this is an incredibly strong start for Nintendo's 2007 lineup. So, what's next? Have you heard of Project H.A.M.M.E.R? Because I hadn't either, and that's because it was cancelled. They expected it to release in summer, but its actual release date was, well, never. From what I've seen, we didn't miss much, which is a shame since O&M were clearly excited.
First party Nintendo game about smashing things up with a sledgehammer. A far cry from the childish image some people associate with the company.
Again with the defensiveness, perhaps a running theme, and again something that will inevitably come to define the Wii era, with it becoming one of the most accessible starter consoles. In spite of the hype over just one demo in mid-2006, the team of developers coming off the success of Metroid Prime Hunters and 1080 Avalanche couldn't get Project H.A.M.M.E.R to stick the landing. It actually sounds like development was awful, with HR-worthy cultural clashes between the Japanese and American teams and constant changes in direction. But the consistent issue that plagued the game was that it was, apparently, just not fun, no matter how much they tried. The surviving footage from the demo looks pretty dull, especially with a harsh comparison to something like Mario Galaxy. The Wii would never be known for beige, washed out, gritty games like this, and even the more memorable, mature games for the console took unique angles to stick out from the crowd. But honestly, we're in the right timeline, since I'd much rather be stuck with the Wii that was defined by games like this, rather than this. While the DS has plenty of big staple games, I think part of the reason why it has such a strong legacy is the massive selection of smaller, high quality games, making it a haven for what are now considered cult classics. Perhaps one of the better known of these, if still pretty obscure, is Hotel Dusk Room 215. The film noir style visual novel will have you holding your DS in a sideways book position as you explore and investigate the mystery behind the eponymous Hotel Dusk. While the game was praised for its mature storyline and gradually built up intrigue, what I think stands out most is a fantastic rotoscoped animation style that still looks impressive. Even now, it can be hard for developers to make characters feel properly expressive, but this choice was absolutely perfect for bringing these characters to life in a way that still looks great on the DS. I use this as my chance to finally pick up the game, and while it shares some common downfalls as a genre, mainly slow pacing, the exploration and dialogue more than make up for this, all supporting the game's strong main narrative. It's not perfect, but it's unique enough to stand out from the slew of other visual novels I haven't played to make it worth seeking out. Also, the game has a lesser known sequel called Last Window: The Secret of Cape West, which thanks to the limited sales of the original was only released in Japan and Europe, but it apparently maintains a standard of quality, so it's worth looking out for or even importing if you enjoyed the first. Resident Evil is one of those series that has just as many spin-offs as it does mainline entries, making it quite hard to fill in all the gaps of the overarching story, even if you manage to play all of the numbered entries. While the Wii missed out on the mainline Resi games of the generation, it did have its own mini sub-series of Chronicles games, with the first Umbrella Chronicles coming out in 2007. Instead of being a more open-ended third-person survival game like the mainline entries, Umbrella Chronicles is split into on-rails first-person episodes which have you using the Wii pointer as your gun, making the game feel a lot like an arcade shooter, and instead of having an original story, it instead retold events from Resident Evil 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4, while adding a handful of original scenes to make it worth playing for veterans. While at the time it was well received for its use of the Wii's unique controls, making the light gun accessory feel necessary, and also just being a more mature Wii game, proving to naysayers that the system wasn't just for kiddie games. But over time, opinions have shifted, with more contemporary reviews calling it an inferior way to experience the stories of the games that it's borrowing from, and noting how badly the occasionally janky gameplay has aged. I wanted to get my hands on it so I could see where my opinions lied, and even though my local retro game shop listed it as being in stock, it turns out that they only had the sequel from a couple years later, Darkside Chronicles. Turns out this is actually a blessing in disguise, since Darkside Chronicles features more of an original story, with my main draw being the explanation of Leon's relationship with Jack Krauser, a boss from 4 who shows up pretty randomly, and it turns out this is where you get his backstory. While Darkside Chronicles is by no means a beloved title either, it's nominally more popular than its predecessor thanks to being able to rectify most of the mistakes of what came before it, and of course, more of an original story gives the game a wider appeal. Playing it myself, while it can't compare to classic Resi gameplay, the arcade style shooting was pretty fun and the typical campy story was well implemented. It definitely felt like it was quite literally designed to be played in an arcade, and it has aged every second since it came out, but there's still some enjoyment to be had. Also, there were allegations from the UK Anglican Church that the game was promoting violence and the occult, and Capcom even went to the effort to publicly defend the game against these accusations, but then it came out that the whole thing might have been a PR stunt. I think if gaming is missing anything these days, it's religious protests, like what happened to Pokemon being the Antichrist. Either way, I'm still a little annoyed I didn't get the chance to play Umbrella Chronicles, but I think trying Darkside Chronicles instead was probably for the best.
It's hard being a Kirby fan. While the likes of Mario and Yoshi are household names, the pink blob hasn't exactly gripped the nation.
It's hard to imagine with how things are now, but in the mid to late 2000s, Kirby was solidly stuck in his flop era. In the early 2010s, things started getting better with Epic Yarn, then Return to Dreamland, Triple Deluxe, Rainbow Curse, Planet Robobot, and then consistent support on the Switch. There isn't one key moment where things turned around, rather just a decade of consistent support, getting the Pink Puff to where he is now. While your parents might not know him, at least your gaming adjacent friends do. However, Kirby's time on the DS was definitely the low point, and there's no better example of that than Squeak Squad, or its much worse European name, Mouse Attack. At least Canvas Curse had the strange advert and eventually got a sequel, and Mass Attack stood out for being pretty late in the DS's life, but Squeak Squad unfortunately ended up making little to no impact at all. It's a shame because 2D Kirby is generally pretty fun, and after Canvas Curse tried something new, it seems like fans wanted the series to go back to basics. But Squeak Squad perhaps took this a little too close to heart and stuck so close to the formula that there's not much reason to go back to this entry in particular. It received a certifiably average reception, and even though it had pretty impressive sales, it didn't do much to work towards the current Kirby renaissance. I don't want to dog on it too much though, because it's still classic 2D Kirby fun, and because it's not that memorable, it's almost looped back around to being the underrated cult classic pick within the Kirby fandom, so at least Squeak Squad has its role in the grand scheme. A much stronger addition to the DS library was a second Ace Attorney game, Justice for All. While the game was originally released in Japan on the GBA all the way back in 2002 and made its way onto the DS in 2006, thanks to the heavy localization and translation that goes into a game this text heavy, it wouldn't make its way to Europe until March of 2007. O&M were excited for the follow-up since the original was a surprise hit, and then when it released just a few months later, they joined the hordes of critics praising its writing and sense of humour. Looking back at it now, however, this entry has unfortunately taken the mantle of the awkward middle child of the original Ace Attorney trilogy. Not being bad, but seen by most as the worst out of the 3 games. Usually this is where I dive into research or actually play some of the game and get a feel for it, but for this particular game I'm abstaining. That's because I'm undeniably slowly working through the Ace Attorney series in chronological order, and this year I finished the second part of the prequel Great Ace Attorney games. This means that I'm still a couple games away from this one and would ideally want to avoid spoilers. However, what I've learned through conversations with a friend who has completed the trilogy, part of the reason why Justice for All is seen as the weakest is the case Turnabout Big Top. This is thanks to it being one of the more contrived storylines in the whole series, but also for its uncomfortable presentation of a 16-year-old girl being the object of lust not just by villains, but also by some of the protagonists as well. In spite of this particular case being a bad egg, the rest of the game still maintains the standard for the series, and as part of the OG trilogy, this game has remained accessible, being on just about every modern device capable of gaming that you can imagine, and is likely part of the reason why Ace Attorney is enjoying its delayed time in the sun. The fandom is more active than ever, and now finally all games are available worldwide as of this year. But if any diehard Ace Attorney fans are watching, how do you think this game in particular stacks up against the rest? If Mario Galaxy was the Wii's biggest hype magnet for the year, then the DS equivalent was the newest Zelda title, Phantom Hourglass. Well, at the time, the game was pretty universally liked. Its reputation has shifted over the years to being seen as one of the 2 awkward Zelda DS games. But as far as DS games go, Phantom Hourglass is clearly one of the best, adapting the 2D Zelda formula and taking liberal inspiration from Wind Waker and making it work with the uniquely intuitive stylocentric controls of the DS. However, within the illustrious halls of the whole Legend of Zelda series, both Phantom Hourglass and its follow-up from a couple of years later, Spirit Tracks, are faced with a lot stronger competition, and somehow fade into obscurity amidst some of gaming's least obscure titles. And honestly, it's a shame. I'm biased because my first Zelda was actually Spirit Tracks, and while the train-centric journey had some bumps, it's an enjoyable take on Zelda, and when I went back to play Phantom Hourglass, I enjoyed it just as much too. Linebeck is one of the best companions in series history, having a deeper personality than the standard, and sailing between various islands to discover what secrets they hide is a perfect abridged Wind Waker experience. It of course has its weaknesses, with the idea of returning to the central Temple of the Ocean King intermittently throughout the game, but with more time on the clock to explore with each repeated attempt, just having a slightly flawed execution. Still, it's really not as bad as some people make it out to be. You'll notice that a lot of the games here have a massive discrepancy between critics and average gamers. That's why I've sourced opinions from both Metacritic and Backlogged so I can get a good handle on this, and I think a big reason for why this is that the critics are nearly always judging at the time of release, rarely going back for a retrospective, whereas user scores tend to be more contemporary, judging with a modern bias and the power of hindsight. With Phantom Hourglass, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Critics loved it when it came out, and O&M were no exception, eventually giving it a 95% when it released in October. Even before its release, they were calling the game's graphics simply stunning, and even as someone who can appreciate the game's quaint aesthetic, I think that's a bit too exaggerated. Of course, I think all of the praise got caught up in a bit of recency bias, but I also don't think it deserves to be seen as a stain on the Zelda series either. You'll see people recommending to newcomers that they can skip both Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, which is a shame since if they do, they're missing out on some of the console's best games. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that the Chibi-Robo series was set up to fail. The first game was released near the end of the GameCube's lifespan in 2005, and its second chance at success, Chibi-Robo Park Patrol on the DS, had its European port silently cancelled, and in America it was exclusive to Walmart. After this, the Baby series barely got another chance to breathe, with a poor-selling Japan-exclusive Wii port, a digital-only 3DS camera game, and then its big return on the 3DS, Chibi-Robo Ziplash, was an average side-scroller that got rid of everything that made the series special, essentially being the death knell for the series since we haven't really heard a peep since. Going back to the second game in the series, Park Patrol on the DS, while it's an enjoyable enough game, it was also probably the start of the downwards trajectory the series would follow for the next decade. Instead of staying indoors like the first title in the series, Park Patrol, as the name suggests, takes you outside to bring some life back to the local park with the help of a horrifying automaton-looking companion, Chet. It honestly looks pretty great when compared to the other 3D environment games on the DS, but it unfortunately doesn't feel at home on the console. Like many early DS games, button inputs are minimal and you select most of your actions from a compact menu on the bottom screen. It works in theory, but even during the short bursts of gameplay that are encouraged, it quickly feels monotonous. And while helping restore a park feels like a natural progression from helping out in a home from the original, the list of tasks this involves is unfortunately a lot more repetitive, which is a shame since the game has plenty of charm to spare, but just nowhere to really let it shine. It's still a cute DS game and it could have been successful if it was marketed, but of course the Chibi-Robo series has never really been given that grace. It did fine in Japan, but of course underperformed in America, since not many people are spontaneously picking up Chibi-Robo Park Patrol alongside their groceries in Walmart, and of course fans in Europe were sadly disappointed that it never got an official release. It was pretty tragic to read O&M talking about how much they loved the original on the GameCube and were excited to see where the series went, with them expecting Park Patrol to release in December, when unfortunately it would never come. While I managed to get my hands on an imported copy, it's pretty inaccessible since there were so few copies printed. I don't think anyone expected it to do well, just another example of how little faith was put in the series. While it's the end of the road for official Chibi-Robo, there's now a light at the end of the tunnel for longtime fans of the series, with previous developers working on a recently announced game called Ko-Robo, which seems as legally close to Chibi-Robo as possible without the holders of the IP suing them for all they're worth. One of the more obscure entries in the list of games coming out in 2007 is a listing of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles for both the Wii and the DS. O&M admitted that they didn't really have many details at all, and were mainly just excited for a follow-up to the GameCube original. While the DS version they're referencing likely turned out to be the relatively average Rings of Fate, I'm more interested in what the Wii version was. While no Crystal Chronicles came out on the Wii in 2007, 4 released over the course of 2008 and 2009. My Life as King and My Life as Dark Lord were both Tower Defense WiiWare exclusives, and Echoes of Time was actually released on both DS and Wii, but the Wii version was essentially just a DS game you could play on the Wii, but with much more awkward controls. The option that really caught my attention is the last game, The Crystal Bearers, a Wii exclusive that was delayed so far into 2009 that there were reports it had been cancelled, and when it did finally come out, ended up being the game that likely killed the Crystal Chronicles subseries as a whole. Ditching the multiplayer-focused RPG gameplay of just about every other Crystal Chronicles game, we instead follow our solo protagonist Lael on an action-adventure using his motion-controlled telekinetic abilities for combat and exploration. Playing it, I could feel all the different ideas that went into putting it together, with plenty of that 2000s RPG charm, complete with awkward voice acting and questionable jokes, and even though these individual elements worked in moments, it never really worked all together. It's trying to be an accessible, easy to control Wii game, but it's also too ambitious and sometimes complex to really be able to pull this off, and while the combat was occasionally interesting, focusing almost entirely on motion controlled telekinesis gets old pretty quickly. It's a shame since I actually enjoyed the protagonist's personality quite a bit, some of his jokes aside, especially when compared to more stoic or silent JRPG protagonists that we're usually stuck with. There was plenty of potential, but even though the game got so delayed, it still manages to feel rushed. A sequel would have done a lot to fix the game's flaws, but unfortunately there wasn't really a demand, and we haven't seen a Crystal Chronicles game since. It's something that feels incredibly hard to imagine now, but there was once a time where the Wii didn't have Mario Kart. It was a wild period between its launch in late 2006 and the time Mario picked up his crown in April 2008. So what did racing fans do until then? Turns out one of the top contenders was Excite Truck. Aside from having heard about it in passing, the name Excite Truck sounded strangely familiar, and as it happens I was overthinking it, and it was because it sounds similar to Excite Bike, and that's because this game takes inspiration from it, being a kind of modern 3D take on it. You've got boosting, a focus on jumping and airtime, and plenty of chances to crash and burn. O&M already had their hands on it, comparing the pacing and speed to F-Zero, which is of course high praise, and they were really laying it on thick.
There's no attempt at realism here, everything is meant to be fun.
Perhaps the 17-year-old hype was infectious, but I went in with pretty high expectations, which is on me, since I of course came out the other end underwhelmed. It actually pioneered the sideways Wii remote control style that Mario Kart would go on to nab a year later, but thanks to the focus on jumping and boosting, there were extra complexities for controlling your trajectory and avoiding a crash. This extra complexity, for a game that is supposedly dumb fun, became distracting. Like almost everything you do is given a star rating, which adds up to a cumulative score, which might be fun for a mission mode, but the fact that it's featured just about everywhere makes it feel like an unnecessary distraction, and thanks to it sharing the same control scheme as Mario Kart, it ends up being an unfavourable comparison, since the plumber had time to fix the mistakes made by Excitruck. The main crime here being how slippy it feels. You can expect that for a game focused on speed, but if every truck feels like it's constantly driving over an oil spill, it just starts to feel like the game is working against you. If I was a game critic forced to put in a certain number of hours before publishing a review, or if I was buying it in 2007 and it was my main purchase to keep me busy, maybe I'd have the willpower to work through the kinks and learn how to tame the game and find more fun in it. As it stands, it's 2024, the game cost me £1.50, the single player was fun enough for a short while, but if I drag my multiplayer guinea pig back for a second round, I fear he won't forgive me. I can see the appeal, but as it is now, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. You wouldn't expect a cute spin-off focused on the slime enemies in Dragon Quest to be surprisingly good, but it turns out that everyone who played Dragon Quest Heroes Rocket Slime has good things to say about it. Even O&M didn't seem to expect much, spending most of their excerpt making fun of the game's absurd concept. Unfortunately for them though, they would never get their hands on it, since the expected release period of spring 2007 has long since been and gone, and the game's European release was eventually cancelled. It's a shame too, since the localization existed and those in Japan and North America who got their hands on it, like I said, had a great time. From those who got a chance to play the now pretty obscure and expensive game, we can learn that it follows our slimy protagonist Rocket, or whatever you choose to rename him, as he works to free his people from their plob oppressors. It's not Shakespeare by any means, but apparently the giant tank battles, 2D Zelda-esque exploration, and town rebuilding with characters like Princess Gluttonetta all work together quite well. That, paired with a pretty adorable pixel art style and liberal references to other Square Enix franchises like Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, and of course Dragon Quest, you can see why it's seen as a bit of a hidden gem. It's a shame that the spin-off wasn't given more space to shine, since its 3DS sequel was further limited to just Japan, and since then slimes have returned to just being enemies in Dragon Quest, albeit still iconic. Mario Slam Basketball, or as it's known outside of Europe, Mario Hoops 3-on-3, is just one of many Mario sports spin-offs that characterize this generation. It is not even the only one on the list. When commenting on the DS game, O&M called the graphics gobsmacking, which is quite enthusiastic, but for a DS game from 2007, I can agree that it still looks pretty good and has some charming animations to boot. And while I'm pretty sure this game could be nominally more fun in multiplayer, the incredibly repetitive gameplay gets old pretty quickly. The stylus controls are intuitive and easy to pick up on thanks to the detailed tutorials, but that doesn't make it any more fun. It's a solid distraction, and for the low cost I picked it up for, it's more than worth it, but I can't imagine trying to squeeze hours out of it if I bought it new at launch. On the topic of the launch era, while it doesn't matter now, the game was critiqued for not having Wi-Fi options, severely limiting the versatility of the multiplayer, and since the download play for local multiplayer was limited too, it would have made convincing your friends to play it with you pretty tough, especially considering you could just play something more fun like Mario Kart on the same console. However, one thing this game has that Mario Kart doesn't is playable Final Fantasy characters, for whatever reason. Maybe if I was more passionate about basketball and or Mario, it would have clicked, but unfortunately that isn't the case. Star Fox wasn't in a great position in 2007. The last two entries in the series weren't that well received and had strayed from what made the earlier entries popular, so there was quite a bit of pressure on Command for the DS to put the series back on track. While it initially appears to be a return to the classic flying combat of the original series, it still tried something new, which is fine, but unfortunately the experiment here was unsuccessful. Instead of being a completely on-rail shooter, Command integrates strategy gameplay to give you a level of preemptive control over your route for a level. While you would think that method of interactivity would be an upgrade, it instead removed the momentum you get from being on a predetermined route, and instead replaced it with a slower, clunkier style of flying. It's also funny that O&M featured this in their 50 games that will help Nintendo own 2007, since as they admitted, they'd already played it and reviewed the game ahead of its January release, and they had a pretty lukewarm response, and for them to have an underwhelmed response for a first-party Nintendo project, when they tended to skew positive thanks to being an official Nintendo magazine after all, it's pretty damning. Like, didn't they want to prove Nintendo was owning 2007, not just doing okay? It really hasn't gotten any better for Star Fox Command in the years since either. While the critics at the time were half-heartedly positive, gamers have just gotten harsher, with the game quickly feeling dated and sitting at a rough 2.6 on Backlogged. And for the Star Fox series in general, it's been even worse. Even though 2007 was so long ago, there's only been one truly new title since then, with Star Fox Zero on the Wii U, likely being the franchise's last chance. Since it's been 9 years since then, Nintendo's answer was clear, which sucks, because on-rail shooters need a comeback, and if it's not going to be Kid Icarus, it might as well be Star Fox. So let's all blame Command for being the penultimate nail in the coffin. That felt a bit depressing, but it doesn't get much better with a game literally called Sadness. But can it really be called a game if there's little proof it ever existed? Another cancelled game for the Wii, things are even more obscure with Sadness, since its development and eventual abandonment are still wrapped in quite a bit of mystery. Sadness was announced with a concept trailer in March of 2006 before the Wii even had an official name. Supposedly a psychological horror game set in pre-World War I Ukraine, the trailer showed some ideas of how motion controls could be used in gameplay, and the general tone of the game, but little else. The developers for Sadness did quite a bit to hype up the game, as O&M pointed out the highly publicised fact that the game was being made in collaboration with horror authors and psychologists. But they also pointed out, even this early on, how strange it was that no footage had been seen yet, just concept art and the first trailer. Public opinions shifted on Sadness the further it got into development, with more and more accusations of it being vaporware, a term I was unfamiliar with before researching this, being hardware or software that has been publicly announced but doesn't actually exist. The accusations intensified and the game was getting further and further delayed, with its last release window being 2009, which it of course missed. The game was quietly cancelled in early 2010, and as it turns out, the vaporware accusations were pretty close to the truth. While plenty of concept and design work had been done, when it came to actually putting the game together, the only 3D object that had been created was a single minecart. It's a shame because it's an interesting concept and the ideas that were presented seemed like they had potential, but as it turns out, Nibris, the studio working on the game, were better at marketing than they were actually putting anything together. Interestingly enough though, a fair amount of the staff who were part of Nibris, which of course quickly crumbled after Sadness fell apart, went on to join Bloober Team, who in spite of their quirky name, found plenty of success working on other high-profile horror games like Blair Witch, The Medium, and most recently the Silent Hill 2 remake, that at the time of writing is only a few weeks old and has been pretty well received, so it all worked out in the end. Kinda. Big Brain Academy alongside other games like Brain Training were a massive hit on the DS, so it only made sense that a Wii version would follow it up. Cutely named Big Brain Academy Wii Degree in North America, in PAL regions it's straight to business, just being Big Brain Academy just on the Wii this time. The main focus this time was on multiplayer, which makes sense for it being on a home console. It is essentially the same thing from the DS, just on the big screen, and with the option to compete against friends locally in timed battles. Since you can get this game for pennies nowadays, as there are 3 million copies kicking about, I tried it out and even managed to wrangle a friend into multiplayer. The foundation of these games is never really getting smarter, I think it's just more gimmicky fun, and that's exactly what it was. Some of these mini games are more fun than others, and while it doesn't have much depth, I can see the appeal at trying to improve since the higher difficulty challenges are actually pretty tough. Even though this game sold incredibly well, like I said 3 million, and was a massive asset for the Wii in 2007, I also can see why this game didn't outperform or have the same cultural impact as the DS version. You can convincingly try and play a game like this daily on a handheld, but going to the effort to boot up your Wii to play occasionally entertaining brain teasers for 15 minutes just doesn't have the same appeal. But maybe the series had more staying power than I thought since we got a Switch sequel in 2021, but I don't think that made much noise, so maybe it's the end for Big Brain Academy. One series that absolutely thrived on the DS was Harvest Moon, and while it was already out in Japan in 2005 and North America in 2006, it wasn't until spring 2007 that Harvest Moon DS made its way to European DSs. While this is the first of a handful of Harvest Moon titles to grace the console, unfortunately it's also the one to go down as likely being the most average. The follow-ups on the DS went on to add some twists to the classic formula, this one instead stuck pretty close to what made the series work, for better or for worse. In my eyes, it seems to have one of the most average receptions I've seen compared to just about everything else here. 67 on Metacritic, 3.4 on Backlogged, its reception on Wikipedia literally just says it's average. I'm sure that this is someone's childhood Harvest Moon, and probably holds a lot of nostalgia for some people, but compared to other Harvest Moons, there isn't really much reason to go back to this one in particular. However, in my search for something interesting to mention, I did find a couple bits worth highlighting. First, you can only play as a male protagonist in Harvest Moon DS, and thanks to the era, that means only female love interests. But to cover this, an altered version called Harvest Moon DS Cute was released where you can play as a girl and romance a handful of new bachelors. If you want to be a cute boy, too bad. And second, only in the original Harvest Moon DS, at the start of the game you have the option to not save the mayor from being attacked by your dog, and if you don't, he'll be killed and you'll be sent straight to credits. Also, when talking about Harvest Moon DS and the feature, H.A.M.M.E.R stated,
"If there's one field of employment that's criminally underrepresented in the world of video games, it's farming."
And if that isn't a sign of how times have changed, then I don't know what is. At the start of 2007, H.A.M.M.E.R only knew the upcoming Sims title as The Sims for the Wii, with a glimpse at a brand new art style. Little did they know that by the time its May release date came around, it would be the completely different and surprisingly popular sub-series MySims. Even though I remember adverts and sequels for the series dominating essentially the entire lifetime of the Wii, I never had the desire to pick it up, and I hadn't really thought about it since then. But incredibly recently, a port of the first two games, titled in a very aware of modern trends way, the MySims Cozy Bundle, was announced and quickly released. As well as being a blast from the past, it also got me wondering if there was something to these games that I'd overlooked for them to have the staying power to warrant a modern port 17 years later. Playing it for a while, I can see why these games did so well, with the first selling 3.7 million and being the best selling Sims on a Nintendo console, since it simplified traditional Sims gameplay that was already so popular, making it more relaxed with less focus on time management and the chibi art style paired with actual characters instead of the procedurally generated characters in the mainline entries. You start to get an image of why these games have such a wide demographic, especially with younger gamers. It reminds me a lot of modern Animal Crossing thanks to just how much focus there is on decorating and then socializing as a secondary game mechanic. It actually makes a lot of sense that they're getting ported since New Horizons was so popular and started the boom of cozy gaming on the Switch. With MySims feeling so similar, I actually have hope for this series to succeed on current consoles. The Wii version of course felt quite dated and pretty slow, but I'm also fully aware that I'm likely not the target demographic either. However, I would be interested to see if the series takes off again if the new port is successful, since there's a pretty strong foundation for it. Final Fantasy is perhaps one of the most ported series in history, and the DS was just another vessel for this. However, instead of opting for a more standard port like we see with most 2D Final Fantasy games, throughout the lifespan of the DS, both Final Fantasy 3 and 4 were remade on the system. At the time these are just called Final Fantasy 3 and 4, but if you want to find them on something more modern like Steam, they're labelled as a 3D remake. But of course, that's the power of hindsight, and back in 2007, all we knew is that Final Fantasy 3 was coming to the DS with a new look. While 3 is popular in some circles of the Final Fantasy fanbase, is by no means one of the most popular, often overshadowed by 4 and 6. And it doesn't help that the original doesn't have much story to help it stand out either, something which sounds wild considering how story-centric more recent Final Fantasy games are. Instead, 3 is more well known for its fantastic job system and more open-ended progression, so it's definitely worth trying if you enjoy RPGs more for the gameplay rather than the story. However, while most Final Fantasy remakes are pretty faithful, the DS remake of 3 added just as many changes as they could without ripping apart the game's core DNA. The main example of this is that they actually named the party members, gave them personalities, and with this, added extra scenes of dialogue to help flesh them out. Of course, they could only do so much thanks to the bare bones origins of the characters, but it helps if you like getting attached to your party. On top of this, secret bosses and more bonuses were added to give you more to do throughout. Of course, which version of Final Fantasy 3 you prefer is down to taste, but if you want a pretty definitive way to play it on the go, then picking up the DS version is actually quite convenient. With how popular the Wii was, it's no surprise that it was littered with licensed games clogging up store shelves as shovelware with recognisable faces pasted on top, and of course anime games are no exception. However, even though I'm not particularly a fan of the franchise, I've seen that Dragon Ball has always been a bit more thoughtful with its video game adaptations. While I'm sure that there are some stinkers in the mix, one sub-series that amassed quite a following is the Budokai Tenkaichi series, with its second entry being ported onto the Wii from the PS2. If you're not a fan, then you might not recognise the name of the spin-off, but you might recognise the name of its most recent entry, Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, which just released this year after a massive 17-year hiatus, to much fanfare and the sales to match. But back to the second entry on the Wii, while motion controls are now seen as pretty gimmicky and not the ideal method for inputting combos for a fighting game, back in 2007 it was still a novel concept, and because of this version of the game went down quite well. When O&M finally got their hands on it, they had plenty of fun saying,
Loads to do, tons of moves, great action, and numerous characters to play with. This is a vast game that has plenty of Dragon Ball Z characters and plots for the fans.
And Nintendo Power had even more praise for the port's controls, claiming,
"After you wave the Wii Remote and Nunchuck to unleash Goku's Spirit Bomb attack, I guarantee you won't want to go back to hitting a simple button combination."
In retrospect, I doubt that, but it's sweet to see how excited they were to waggle the Wii Remote around to control a fighting game. Even so, it's clear to see that this addition to the Wii's library had some hype behind it, in spite of being a licensed game, managing to be the only one to make its way onto O&M's feature. Back before it was given its official English subtitle of Radiant Dawn, the Wii entry for the Fire Emblem series was known as a rough translation for its Japanese title, Goddess of Dawn. Looking back, it's hard to imagine a world where Fire Emblem isn't the consistently successful series it is now after its soft reboot with Awakening on the 3DS, but Radiant Dawn for the Wii was essentially the last chance the series was given before that. Saying all that makes it sound like Radiant Dawn is an awful game, but that really isn't the case. It was well received at the time, and while some aspects of it felt dated, and that hasn't gotten any better with age, it's still quite well liked by fans of the series, having a pretty impressive 4.1 on Backlogged. However, I don't think Radiant Dawn was set up to succeed. It's a direct sequel to Path of Radiance on the GameCube, a game that didn't have that wide of an audience in the first place, so its follow-up, which expects you to have played the first, isn't exactly the best place for newcomers to start. On top of this, a very classic feeling strategy game so early on in the Wii's life meant it was getting overshadowed by pretty much everything else. It also seems that Nintendo didn't plan for the game to succeed either, since barely any copies were printed, so getting your hand on either Path of Radiance or Radiant Dawn is incredibly expensive if you want to play them. It's a bad sign that when I saw Radiant Dawn selling for £70, I thought, wow, that's the cheapest I've ever seen it. With how popular the franchise is now, I really hope this pair of games get another chance as a remake or remaster, since as they stand now, they're really inaccessible. The Metal Slug series has been about for ages. Even back in 2007 when the Anthology was released on the Wii, it had been about for ages. It's actually pretty sad to look back and see that this is still pretty much the meat of the entire franchise, since after this, the series largely turned into a series of mobile games. But a new tactics game just released, so maybe that'll breathe a fresh lease of life into the dormant series. But back to the Anthology, this port for the Wii includes the 7 Metal Slug games being 1 to 6 and also the remake of 2 called X. If you're unfamiliar with the series, they're all side-scrolling arcade-style shooters with high-energy gameplay, and you can play almost all of them multiplayer too. I'm honestly so thankful that the graphics weren't updated for this port, since the pixel art is timeless and still looks fantastic. Compared to a lot of other Wii games from 2007, you don't really get the chance to say that often. While this version for the Wii was convenient at the time of release, there isn't really much reason to dust off your Wii for this particular game now, since it's been ported to both the PS4 and Steam, and since the Wii version only supports Wii remotes or GameCube controllers, a modern system is likely preferable, or if you want it on the go, it was also released on the PSP at a similar time. It was a great addition to the Wii's library for 2007, but there's not too much reason to go back to this version in particular. So, in the early 2000s, Square Enix decided they were super into this concept of polymorphic content, where they would essentially spread their IP onto as many systems as possible to increase brand exposure and recognition. The most well-known example of this was their expanded Final Fantasy VII universe, and it would also explain why the Kingdom Hearts series used to require owning every Sony and Nintendo console of the decade to play through. This strategy extended to the Mana series, with a project being called World of Mana, and the first game for this was Children of Mana, releasing on the DS just about everywhere in 2006 except Europe in early 2007. You would think that Square would want to capitalise on the strengths of the Mana series if they were trying to promote it, but instead Children of Mana decided it would water down the series' signature action RPG gameplay while also decreasing the importance of story to create a pretty underwhelming final package. While it retained the series' high standard for quality in its soundtrack and the graphics were fine, everything else unfortunately suffered. Its main focus would be on dungeon crawling, but thanks to the choice to use procedurally generated randomized layouts, the gameplay ended up feeling tedious to grind through. I actually don't mind games like this sometimes. I have a soft spot for the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, but that's because they at least have an interesting story and the combat has some depth. While I tried to get my hands on as many games as I could for this project, I was not tempted at all thanks to just about everything I heard about Children of Mana. Even the usually pretty positive O&M who seemed hyped for the DS dungeon crawler in their feature called the gameplay extremely repetitive by the time they got their hands on it, and that's one of the more forgiving opinions. Deco said the game feels like a boring chore, Video Gamer called the gameplay mindless, but perhaps my favourite is Play Magazine, noting that the multiplayer option only makes the game slightly more appealing, saying,
"This game is more fun with a bunch of friends, but so is going to the DMV or getting a root canal."
While Atlus are now most well known for the Persona series and perhaps mainline Shin Megami Tensei 2, back in the mid to late 2000s they were behind a short-lived series of visual novel and surgery simulation games called Trauma Center. While there hasn't been a new entry since 2010, the series actually got quite popular and were well liked by critics and those who were willing to give it a try. Its first title was on the DS and underperformed massively in Japan, but luckily Atlus went to the effort of localizing it in North America and Europe since it sold way above expectations and prompted the series to continue for a few new entries. The first of its sequels wasn't actually a sequel at all, in spite of being subtitled Second Opinion. It was actually just a remake of the first, redesigned around the Wii and overall seen as an improvement. I actually tried one of the Wii Trauma Center games years ago and enjoyed it for a while until I accidentally killed a patient and quit from the guilt. But picking up the Wii Remote Scalpel again, I was happy to discover that Second Opinion holds up really well. I enjoy visual novels, but sometimes I find that they can drag, so switching it up with a surprisingly enjoyable surgery gameplay and a snappy episode structure meant that working through the story was paced incredibly well. Out of all the Dead series I've covered, I really hope that this one gets a revival the most, but with how successful Persona is, I doubt that Atlus are interested in bringing this back anytime soon. While nowadays we're lucky that new Pokemon games have global launch dates, back with Generation 4 and Diamond and Pearl, Japan got the games over half a year before anywhere else, with most regions having to wait till mid-2007, except poor Korea which had to wait until 2008. New Pokemon games were of course a massive asset to the DS in 2007, but it's hard to speak about Diamond and Pearl without bias since this was my first Pokemon. It's not only just these core games though, but the era as a whole. Growing up with all the spin-offs and multimedia, it of course holds a special place. Like my two favourite Pokemon, Skuntank and Ambipom, were introduced here. And even though Pokemania of the late 90s and early 2000s had definitely passed by this point, everything still felt like it was in full swing. With all that in mind though, I'm happy to admit that this is a pretty flawed pair of games. Even at the time, it was criticised for sticking too close to the formula. In spite of their glowing review, O&M called it effectively a fancy remake of past Pokemon adventures, and that's understandable since the main additions this generation made to the franchise weren't that flashy, instead more subtle but important changes like the optimizations to the battle system and online features. But a game being derivative of what came before it doesn't inherently make it bad, but Diamond and Pearl don't particularly do anything the best within the context of the entire series. It doesn't help either that the definitive edition of these games, Platinum, was a much needed upgrade, sanding off the game's edges and adding plenty of extra features that make it a much more enjoyable adventure to play through overall. I would also argue that the next generation with Black and White and its sequels Black 2 and White 2 also kind of overshadow this generation. Even though they were controversial at release, time has been much more generous to these games. Also, since Black and White 2 are sequels, there's actually some reason to return to the prequels, but after Platinum, there isn't much reason to go back to Diamond and Pearl aside from maybe some exclusive Pokemon. This all sounds very harsh, especially considering Diamond was the first game I was properly obsessed with, and likely heavily influenced the foundations of how I interact with not just Pokemon, but gaming as a whole. However, I would argue that the real villain here is the awful remakes these games are stuck with. The Wii is known for many things, but one aspect that doesn't get as much attention is how the console is a graveyard for home console Pokemon, at least for a couple of generations. Pokemon has always been more at home on a console you can take on the go, but as the series flourished on handhelds, it at least started off with a strong foundation of home console entries with the Pokemon Stadium games on N64 and the Pokemon Coliseum games on GameCube. You would assume that the success would only continue on a console as big as the Wii, but unfortunately the spiritual successor to these games, Pokemon Battle Revolution, snuffed any hopes of this. Even though Battle Revolution still looks pretty fantastic, it garnered criticism for being incredibly bare bones when compared to its predecessors. While Stadium and Coliseum had side modes and a strong base of gameplay to keep you busy for hours, Battle Revolution was instead seen as an expensive accessory for Diamond and Pearl. Even O&M looked forward to the game hoping it could be the first classic Pokemon console game. They ended up just calling it an entirely cosmetic companion to the DS game. I actually picked up this game myself when I was younger, and even though I found transferring Pokemon from my DS onto the big screen entertaining for a while, all the critics unfortunately had a point. There just really isn't much to do. It's even worse if you pick it up not knowing that if you don't have Diamond and Pearl to hand, that you'll only be able to use a team of rental Pokemon against the NPCs the bare bones challenge of the game throws at you. It's a shame since I had the look down and the animations are still used to embarrass modern Pokemon games for just how bad they look by comparison, but it being pretty didn't make it a good game. With the Switch there isn't really any more need for games that combine home console and handheld Pokemon since they're now the same thing, but it's still sad the series had such an underwhelming death. The world of Final Fantasy is honestly complicated enough already, but it gets even more convoluted when you start to consider the sequels too. I don't think anyone expected there would be a follow-up to the 2006 PS2 exclusive Final Fantasy XII the very next year on the DS, or that it would be a real-time strategy game using mostly touch controls, but that's the world we live in. It seems that even journalists from the release period were confused about what exactly Revenant Wings was before it came out. O&M seemed to expect that it would be a remake of the original, but no, it's a canonical follow-up to the events of the first. While there is fun to be had with Revenant Wings, there's an expectation that you're already a fan of Final Fantasy XII and RTS games, but even then, the RTS gameplay just isn't the best fit for the DS screen. In the early game it's fine since everything's a bit more manageable, but as you get further in, the chaos of battles just becomes too much to handle when considering you're working with a small real estate of the DS touchscreen. The consensus seems to be, if you're interested and invested in the cast of Final Fantasy XII, watch a summary, because the gameplay just isn't enough to justify actually playing it. We once again see the ugly head of the "we isn't just for kids" insecurity rear its head when it comes to the anticipation for Disaster Day of Crisis.
Astonishingly, despite being home to gory games such as Resident Evil 4, Killer 7 and Hitman 2, the GameCube is still seen as a console for kids. With games like Disaster Day of Crisis, no one will be able to say the same for the Wii.
Hypothetically, they're not wrong, but no one remembers a Wii for Day of Crisis, and that's probably a good thing. That's actually harsh, the game isn't atrocious, but definitely not the opposite either. Disaster Day of Crisis is essentially a natural disaster themed action game with some light survival exploration gameplay in between on-rail shooting segments. It works okay, but in how hard the game is trying to be gritty, the story comes across melodramatic and the aesthetic is pretty bland. Playing through the opening levels, I was struck by just how much it tries to do, and while I admire its enthusiasm, we all know that if you try a bit of everything, none of it will ever be outstanding. There are some moments of charm mixed in though, the oversized pieces of food that you come across to heal with and the animation that comes with them completely contrasts the serious tone of everything else, and the same goes for the running animation in the sprinting QuickTime events, because of course you need a QuickTime event for that. Also, I couldn't help but be distracted by just how much the main character Ray looks like the future child of Gladio and Ignis from Final Fantasy XV. While the game never really built up a legacy for itself, it does have a pretty high profile hater, so high profile that they likely blocked the game getting released in North America. Head of Nintendo America at the time and gaming icon Reggie Fils-Aimé publicly hated the Nintendo published game, calling it laughable and overpriced. This, paired with the game's poor sales everywhere else, it was a sad day for North American natural disaster fans who just wanted a chance to try Day of Crisis since the port was promptly cancelled. Another sign of how times have changed.
World War II games are 10 a penny.
Thank God, not anymore. I forget that the gaming industry used to be obsessed with churning out every take on the Second World War imaginable, but Blazing Angels Squadrons of World War II serves as a relic of the era. Notably, this dogfighting simulator was out about a year earlier on everything else before it was added to the illustrious Wii library, and that time was likely dedicated to trying to make it look passable and work out a control scheme. Unfortunately, that effort was in vain. It's hard to be a true judge of the graphics from a game from so long ago, since of course I'm going to be harsher with a modern perspective, but seeing that people back then were critiquing it makes me feel a little less guilty saying that it looks like shit. And the choice for the steering to be controlled with a nunchucks motion control means that moving through the air and aiming, the main goal of the game, is unresponsive and awkward. This is all from personal experience. For whatever reason, there isn't much of a reseller market for Blazing Angels, so my wallet isn't much lighter after picking it up. I'm sorry to say that I didn't 100% this classic, but if that's something that sounds appealing to you, then I'm sure your masochism knows no bounds. But if I ever want to lose a friend in record time, then I can always suggest a round of this game's multiplayer. Even in its first few years, the DS had quite a handful of surprise hits, see Brain Training, and another example of this is Cooking Mama. And what are 2007 Nintendo going to do if they see something doing well on the DS? Well, they're going to put it on the Wii too, see Trauma Center, and this resulted in varying degrees of success. I hadn't picked up a Cooking Mama game before this, but I've always been passively interested since cooking games can sometimes be fun, the microgame structure reminded me of WarioWare, and I also have a couple of friends who grew up playing the series and had a great time, and you'd think that motion controls would work well for the type of universal motions people associate with cooking, but unfortunately that just doesn't work here. Trying to make pudding, Italian squid ink spaghetti, and popcorn in multiplayer had its funny moments, but it was really more laughing at the game than with it. I'd seen that it had been critiqued for unresponsive motion controls, but I scoffed thinking it couldn't be that bad. But when the game is telling you to shake the controller to stop the popcorn kernels from burning, but it doesn't believe that you're moving the controller, even though you definitely are, and then it, of course, immediately burns, ending the minigame, all you can really do is laugh. Multiplayer made it a bit more bearable, since having someone sit through the motion controlled torture simultaneously is at least some form of trauma bonding, but by the end I was wishing I was playing one of the DS cooking mamas with a responsive touchscreen instead. Also, a controversial tidbit from when it first came out, there were accusations that publications like Wired were being paid to big up how fun the game was pre-release, with them naming it their best game of CES 2007. In retrospect, that's pretty rough for the game that people were so pissed off at it being disappointing that their only explanation for why journalists liked it is that they were being paid. Not to say the gayest sentence I've uttered, but I was never one for football growing up, and that hasn't changed with age, but even then I found something about the aesthetic of Mario Strikers Charged appealing, and I was further exacerbated by seeing the special move animations for characters like Peach and Daisy. This game has personality which seems to be lacking with the series' most recent entry on the Switch. This appeal of the Wii title was never enough to make me want to actually pick up the game, but when this project gave me an excuse, I was hesitantly excited to actually finally play it. I'm happy to report that the personality was reflected in the gameplay. Even though the graphics are of course a little dated, the animations are still fantastic and make the Mario characters more expressive than ever. I've always wondered why every other Mario sports game has such a soft and friendly look, but they decided that football is a spin-off they decided to give such a bold art style, but it really makes sense with how aggressive the gameplay is. I never thought I would be playing a Mario game where the plumber can shove his brother into an electric fence, but here I can make that dream a reality. I think the reason why it's fun is that it's so far divorced from real football thanks to all the Mario extraness added to it. Kind of like how Mario Kart isn't really what driving is like unless you're Caitlyn Jenner. If you've ever been interested in trying the Mario Strikers series but you're not willing to pay for the Switch version, then dusting off your Wii for this, which goes for a fraction of the cost, is well worth it. Smash Bros is undeniably one of the biggest series in gaming and massively influential, pioneering and dominating the platform fighter subgenre. Every entry in the series stands out in its own way, but as the series is now, it kind of feels like Brawl on the Wii is a black sheep. It has a grungier, edgier look, a massive reminder of the era it was released in. Just look at Mario's defined denim overalls. It introduced features that would become series staples like final smash moves, but also had one-off ideas like the only really fleshed out story mode in the series and the infamous tripping mechanic. I grew up with it so I can overlook a lot of its mistakes and love all the weird quirks that makes it stand out. But what I think people forget is that Brawl reinvented video game hype. The lead up to Brawl's launch was extensive, with the typical E3 trailers and official statements, but what was unique was the Smash Bros Dojo website. Between May 2007 and April 2008, there were updates added to the website every weekday going over new details and discussing the game's development. It was a great way to draw attention and stands out as one of the earliest and most impactful online marketing campaigns for a video game. Smash Dojo was a perfect way to keep fans tided over since the game went through some pretty significant delays. O&M assumed at the beginning of 2007 that it would be out by summer, but it wouldn't reach Europe until the next summer of 2008. It was of course worth the wait, and even though it isn't that fondly remembered by competitive players, it's still a fantastic Smash game to go back to even if it's just for the story. Also, unlike most promotional websites from the 2000s, you can go back and look through Smash Dojo in its original form even now, with the domain still active, at least at the time of writing. It's of course dated, but preserved. Well, mostly preserved at least. Rest in peace Adobe Flash Player. It is a shame that the reputation of the Wii is seen as having a few family games that took advantage of motion controls and a litany of real games that were held back by having motion controls shoved in where they didn't need to be. I think it's a shame because it means that titles like No More Heroes are often glossed over. As Travis touched on, your aim is to work your way to the top of the League of Assassins by, well, assassinating them. In between these missions, you need to complete odd jobs to earn the money you need for each major assassination attempt, and for the most part the Wii's motion controls are used frequently and implemented well. There are some examples of it not being perfect, like with some of the mini-games for the jobs, but otherwise, and especially in the combat, the motion controls work well and actually suit the sword swinging of the game perfectly. While there are definitely signs of its age, when returning to the game nowadays, thanks to the cel-shaded style and bright colour scheme, it at least doesn't hurt to look at. Even though the game's Japanese sales initially disappointed, it did well in America and then even better in Europe, proving that there was an audience for games like this on the Wii. It ended up with a sequel a couple of years later, but after that it seemed like the short-lived series had been forgotten. Luckily, it retained enough of a fanbase to be revived in the Switch era with a spin-off and then a multi-platform full-fledged third entry. I went back to play a lot of the games from this feature specifically to talk about them as part of this video, but No More Heroes is the only one that I'd played recently purely for my own entertainment. Because of that, I'll hold back most of my opinions for my ranking of everything I played this year, hopefully out sometime in December, but safe to say I had a good time. Some games have truly been lost to time, but one of the best examples of this is Dead and Furious, or its cornier but at least more memorable American title, Touch the Dead. There's no necrophilia as this name might imply, instead it's an on-rail zombie shooter that has you aiming with the DS touchscreen. This idea has potential. Metroid Prime Hunters had already proved that you can make enjoyable shooters for the DS, and there was definitely a market for people who wanted to prove that you can have more mature games for the handheld. Even though the idea of shooting with a touchscreen has promise, it unfortunately never got anywhere thanks to just about everything else. On top of the repetitive sound design, poor graphics even when compared to the low bar set by other 3D environments on the DS, the core issue that made it so unenjoyable and even unfinishable is how you reload. You have to manually drag bullets from one side of the touchscreen to the other, and with how long this finicky action takes, you'll no doubt take damage from the oncoming horde of the undead. In the earlier levels this isn't too much of an issue, but as the game gets more challenging there just isn't time. Critics hated it when it came out, and even retro gamers willing to give it a chance now don't like it either. Fun fact though, the North American box art was done by Arthur Saddam, who works on the Marvel Zombies comics, so that's probably where about half the budget went. Castlevania Portrait of Ruin has the advantage of being the second Castlevania on the DS, meaning it could iron out all the kinks the first, Dawn of Sorrow, had to go through, and come out the other end better for it. You can't really tell based on the character designs or really much else, but this game takes place during World War II, another reminder of how enraptured the 2000s were with putting their games in this era. It stands out from the rest of the series for giving you control of two siblings with unique playstyles, one having more physical moveset and the other magic. Even though it has this dual protagonist feature and added plenty of DS exclusive features like online co-op, critics had a problem with it for sticking too close to the traditional Castlevania formula. They still liked the game since there was nothing else they could really critique it for, but it seems like they wanted something different. However, modern gamers going back to it are a lot more forgiving, not really caring about reinvention and more just appreciating that it's a solid game. Castlevania fans consistently rate it highly when ranking the entire series, and it's now had a chance to reach a wider audience with it being ported as part of the Dominus collection earlier this year. While the DS had some great Castlevania games, it feels that the main legacy DS Castlevania will have is the box art for Dawn of Sorrow's re-release. Elite Beat Agents is hands down one of the best DS games, end of sentence. In spite of that, the fact that it got glowing critical praise when it released, the fact that it still holds up, the fact that it's the best use of the DS's hardware, it's now relatively obscure, and still without any sequel. This short rhythm game is technically not part of a wider series, but is essentially a Western exclusive reimagining of the Japanese exclusive Osu Tatake Ouendan. If that name sounds familiar, it's because the rhythm game playstyle went on to inspire the still quite popular PC rhythm game Osu. The original Osu Tatake Ouendan was so popular as an import into the West that the devs thought they would make the most Western appealing version of it possible, and surprisingly it worked. The soundtrack is a stark reminder that the game came out in 2007 with songs like Skater Boy, The Anthem and Makes No Difference, but then it's paired with classics from artists like Madonna, David Bowie and the Jackson 5. Each track will have the agents dancing on the bottom screen as you try to keep up with the rhythm map, all while a unique comic style storyline is taking place on the top screen in beat with the song, showing you how the power of music is helping them escape their wacky predicaments. It works incredibly well, and the songs are split into sections with breaks where you progress the story of the level, and the results will vary depending on how well you performed in that section, letting you get a breather and actually follow what's going on. The touchscreen controls are responsive, the mapping to each track is nearly always perfect, and it's a great example of what the DS in particular is capable of. It's a shame it didn't get a sequel on the 3DS, since the original didn't sell well enough to justify it, and now with the Switch stepping away from using the touchscreen and the lack of two separate screens, I don't know how well it would work. Of course, if you want some more of the same gameplay, Osu can keep you going endlessly, but Elite Beat Agents had something so perfectly put together that it's a shame there isn't more of it. Every now and then it feels like critics will dogpile a certain game, and back when it came out that was Harvest Moon Tree of Tranquility.
If you expect nothing out of the Tree of Tranquility except the same old, then this will do the trick. The Harvest Moon series is starting to show its age. Lame controls, rubbish camera, loads of crappy loading pauses. It seems very cheap.
By the sounds of it, you'd think the Tree of Tranquility would be a stain on the series, but in reality it was just another Harvest Moon game. The farming takes a while to find its rhythm, there's a nice variety of animals to look after, and your opinion on the selection of love interests will depend on your taste. The main crime Tree of Tranquility committed was not reinventing the Harvest Moon series. It seems that back in the late 2000s, a series getting a new safe entry was reason enough for significant criticism, but I think now we've seen games get fucked up up in so many different ways, from unfinished DLC later launches, focus group monstrosities, and the advent of live service and free-to-play, that a game just being a potentially slightly bland but overall well-intentioned new entry in an established series isn't really the worst thing imaginable. While Harvest Moon fans aren't obsessed with Trio Tranquility, since there are better Harvest Moon games even on the Wii, they don't hold as aggressive opinions about it as the onslaught of critics did. The only real issue that everyone can agree on is the short but frequent load screens. So while there isn't much reason to return to Trio Tranquility in particular, it's also not the worst thing ever. I really wasn't expecting much from Dragon Quest Swords. I mean, the name is just kind of on the nose, especially when you consider it's a Wii game. In truth, it also has a subtitle, The Masked Queen and the Tower of Mirrors, but that's too long for me to want to repeat. I just assumed it would be an average sword-fighting arcade-style game, but in truth, the Dragon Quest of it all does a lot of heavy lifting to add charm. The RPG mechanics aren't super deep, but they do add enough depth to make it interesting enough for its runtime, and while the motion controls aren't ideal, getting to choose a focal point of your slashes with a pointer, while not perfect, helps with avoiding the occasionally unresponsive Wii motion controls. But it's a Dragon Quest style that keeps it engaging. The music is fantastic, and while the characters and story are nothing revolutionary, it at least gives you a reason to keep going, and the H.A.M.M.E.R voice acting adds to the ironic enjoyment of an extremely dated game like this. I'm truly in the minority of people who like this game. It does make some strange choices, so I get that. Instead of having an episodic structure arcade-style games like this would usually choose, there's an open hub town which you explore purely using the Wii Remote D-pad, and it's littered with load screens. Part of me thinks that was a regrettable choice, but then I also think it adds to the unrefined charm of the game, but perhaps that's just brain rot. A negative review also highlighted that this game was co-developed by the same team that worked on Pokemon Battle Revolution, Genius Sonority, so 2007 really wasn't their year when it comes to critical acclaim. While that team now exclusively works on Pokemon's free-to-play spin-offs and the Denpa-Men games, the other half of the co-development, H.A.M.M.E.R, mainly worked on licensed games after this, but they've more recently moved their way up to working on Pikmin as well as a free basketball update for Switch Sports, so good for them. Out of most of these games, I think Contact is probably one of the more obscure. That's due to a combination of it not being part of any established franchise, not having made much of a lasting impact, and now its age. On the cultier side of being a cult classic, the majority of responses to this DS action RPG range from it being fine but a little underwhelming, to being alright for a DS game, and then some people thinking it's actually revolutionary. For such a relatively unknown game to have such a wide variety of responses, safe to say my interest was piqued. Unfortunately, upon actually trying it, I think I'm on the average side. It seems to be a perfectly charming DS RPG with very simple combat and an interesting idea of having the top screen constantly occupied by a mysterious professor and his space dog chatting with you, the player, as you control the protagonist on the bottom screen, where he's blissfully unaware of what's going on above him. That in itself is an engaging concept, but the professor unfortunately repeats his lines a little too often for me to enjoy it, and it's more of a distraction that's easy enough to ignore. Also, while I saw some people praising the game's style, it's just really not to my preference. Some DS games have outstanding pixel art, and while the look is fine, the colour palette all blends together and makes it a little hard to perceive or just find visually engaging at all. I appreciate that Contact is a big swing, since that's nearly always better than a run-of-the-mill safe bet, but the meat of the game isn't enough to back up what it's going for. Everyone's favourite furry icon is enjoying a bit of a resurgence in recent years, so let's travel back to a more traumatic time for the Hedgehog. In the wake of Sonic 06, it didn't seem like it could get any worse for the blue blur, so the bar was in hell for Sonic and the Secret Rings. I credit that to why reviews for the game were quite forgiving. Nearly every critic from the era would mention the horrendous release from the year before, and go on to say that this isn't as bad. So when I picked it up originally back in the early 2010s, after having enjoyed other Sonic Wii games like Unleashed, Colors, I even have a soft spot for Black Knight. I expected this would live up to that level of quality, so I was unpleasantly surprised that even with the low standards of my youth, I struggled to get through the tutorial and gave up before making much progress through the first world. Returning to it now, I assume that maybe I was too harsh and impatient and I can enjoy it for what it is. Turns out I wasn't harsh enough, and I hope I never trick myself into going back for thirds. The litany of reasons why Secret Rings doesn't work, but I think a big part of it was the insistence on not using the nunchuck. Controlling Sonic with a Wii remote on its side, tilting to move and shaking to attack doesn't work, and the fact that Sonic auto runs just makes it feel so slow. And for Sonic to feel slow, well, you might as well get the casket. Aside from the clunky controls, there is so much else wrong. Why is there a leveling system? Why are stages hidden behind random challenges? Why is everything so sepia? While critics and Sonic fans alike could stomach this thanks to the bitter taste from the year before, it's clear modern gamers looking for a nostalgia hit like me are nowhere near as forgiving. Sonic and the Secret Rings has the lowest average score on Backlogged of anything on this list. This shocked me since I assumed at least some rabid Sonic fans would have dragged this average up, but I don't think even they want it. At least with 06, it has a legacy, it has a deep well for ironic appreciation, it was ambitious even if misguided, the voice actor for the human princess who falls in love with Sonic is Gretchen Wieners, but Secret Rings has none of that, and if anything, I think that's more damning. While 2007 was the first solid year of the Wii and DS era, it didn't mean that the previous consoles completely died out. Well, for the GameCube that did pretty much happen immediately, but for the Game Boy Advance it still had a little kick left in it. It isn't much exciting, but O&M had one GBA game amidst all the Wii and DS titles they had to look forward to in 2007, listed as Final Fantasy Advance. That wasn't something as big as a new Final Fantasy game for the console, but instead a series of ports for Final Fantasy 4, 5 and 6. There isn't really much reason to go after these now since they're available much cheaper and more conveniently on other consoles, but at the time this was exciting since it was the first time any of them were available on a portable device. It's nice they exist, and this is a fantastic trilogy of RPGs to have available, but it's just strange that they wait until the console is on its dying breath to port them over. At least you can pop the cartridge in your DS to play them there too. In spite of the timing, the ports sold incredibly well, so maybe they waited so long just for there to be no competition on the same console, and it looked like that worked. As a brief association game, what console first comes to mind when you think of Mortal Kombat? The Wii? Me neither. But within its first year, we had a port of Mortal Kombat Armageddon from the year before on the PS2, complete with exclusive motion controls and even more fighters packed in. Given the success of the Wii, even its early days, you can assume that this is a recipe for something great. I still wasn't convinced, but after discovering that the game included A character creator letting you make your own fighter, and B, a racing minigame called Motor Combat, I was sold. But immediately after getting my hands on it, I can understand why fans of the series don't look back at Armageddon with much fondness. First, to get my two selling points out of the way, while the character creator didn't pass my litmus test for a good character creator, letting you give your character a pompadour, so that's a write-off. And then Motor Combat, while a batshit idea and concept, can't really fly far on absurdity alone. What I'm trying to say is, it was bad. So, with the wind out of my sails, I was left to half-heartedly play the actual game. After sitting through the unintentionally hilarious instructional videos that played more like a pitch for why the Wii Remote is really good actually, my hopes were a little higher, and seeing the massive roster, they were bolstered again. But when you get in a fight and you have to play it, it comes crashing down again. Thanks to the control scheme, a lot of the characters feel very similar to play, but perhaps the biggest crime the game commits is getting rid of traditional fatalities, replacing them with a one-size-fits-all, customizable approach to work around the character creator. But you can't have Mortal Kombat without fatalities. I'm not exactly a die-hard fan, but that's pretty basic foundations there. And while it doesn't really matter now, the game didn't have any online features, which for a fighting game feels like a massive wasted opportunity. Everything about this game and the fact that it's on the Wii is just funny. It at least gave fighting game fans something to chew on before Smash, but they clearly spat it out because for whatever reason Mortal Kombat never returned to the Wii after. The Megaman series has a reputation for having just as many spin-off franchises as it does mainline entries, and one of those spin-offs that doesn't get as much love as the others is Megaman ZX. The game first came out in 2006 in Japan and North America, only making its way to PAL regions in 2007, and it only had one sequel, ZX Advent, on the DS as well. Every Megaman spin-off has a gameplay quirk that makes it stand out from the main series, and for ZX it's having an open world. Being a 2D platformer with an open world is immediately labelled by some as a Metroidvania, but since it doesn't particularly feel too much like either a Castlevania or a Metroid game, it doesn't really fit that niche, instead just being a more open-ended take on Mega Man. While it was praised at release as feeling closer to a traditional Mega Man, especially after Battle Network dominated the GBA, over time opinions have gotten a little harsher. With just how popular open-ended platformers became in the 2010s, Metroidvania or not, it meant that Mega Man ZX continued to be judged compared to stronger and stronger titles, and even though critics were generally positive when it came out, it never sold well, only being the 6th best-selling title of the week it released in Japan. Getting only one sequel makes it the shortest Mega Man spin-off series, and it's a shame since it likely won't get revived, since a new title in this style will be a lot more successful now than it was when it was released. Tastes have changed and people have really embraced less linear platformers. At least both entries are ported onto the Switch in 2020 as part of a collection, so it's not that hard to get your hands on if you want to give it a try. After its recent Switch remakes, the Advance Wars series has now regained some of its public notoriety and could even see some new entries if we're lucky. What you likely don't know unless you're a diehard fan of the series is that in the mid-2000s, Advance Wars had a short-lived spin-off real-time strategy series called Battalion Wars, with the first on the GameCube in 2005 and the second on the Wii releasing in 2007. The gameplay loop is solid. You'll lead your units throughout the stage in third person, getting involved in the battle where necessary, all the time strategically ordering different units using your commands. With a cartoonish 3D take on the Advance Wars style that fits the graphical capabilities of the Wii and a story that doesn't take itself too seriously, it should all work. The problem is, none of the pieces fit together. With real-time strategy, there needs to be a reason for it to be real-time, and with how lacking the active combat is in Battalion Wars II, there wasn't much reason why this couldn't just be a standard strategy game. The real-time element can be used to add tension and stakes, but instead this just felt painfully slow. The early levels especially plodded along, with so many breaks for poorly voice-acted, unskippable tutorial exposition. Usually I enjoy bad voice acting, but the fact that it was constantly breaking up the gameplay before it could find a chance to get its footing made it painful. While the animations were cute, the graphics never really worked, with strange textures, models that looked outdated even for the era they were released in, and a colour palette that flip-flopped between bland and way too oversaturated. When core Advance Wars has such a strong and charming look, you just end up wishing that they stuck a little closer to what inspired it, or hey, just made another Advance Wars instead. That's not to say that trying something different isn't admirable, but I'm not going to pretend it was much fun either. It did go out of its way to try and amend one of the main complaints from the GameCube original, being a lack of multiplayer, which they added. That's not something that really shows up as much now, especially with how rigid the divide feels between single and multiplayer experiences. That aside, I wasn't going to force a friend to sit down with me, suffer through the hefty tutorial levels while I lecture them on why the multiplayer of this game I'm not particularly enjoying can make the game nominally more enjoyable for me at the sacrifice of both of our valuable time and willpower. Maybe if it was 2007, but even then I feel like my ancestors would have had to put me in some serious karmic debt to put me in that situation. It's hard to imagine now, but the Mario Party series used to get releases almost every year. Between 1998 and 2007, they only took 2001 and 6 off. The game that killed this streak was Mario Party 8 on the Wii. While opinions on this entry have softened over time, mainly because the series went a bit haywire for the next two games, forcing everyone into the same car, when it was released, it was panned. It was clear that the game was likely intended for the GameCube, the biggest piece of evidence for this being the 4:3 aspect ratio, and just how shoehorned in the motion controls felt. On top of this, it felt painfully unoriginal, doing nothing new for the series and didn't feature any particularly standout minigames. It wasn't awful, it was still a Mario Party game, but it felt so phoned in that even though it was a first for the Wii, it just didn't impress. It was my first Mario Party, but even I don't have much nostalgia for it, because even at a young age, I can remember it just feeling a bit off. Of course, getting so much negative attention led to Nintendo slowing down the series, but also wanting to reinvent, and that's why we got Mario Party 9 and 10, which felt like such a left turn in a worse direction. The good news is that with Mario Party flubbing the Wii era so hard, it left room for Wii Party to dominate, and with how much fun that was, I don't see an issue. Also, Mario Party did eventually get back on path, but it did take until the Switch generation for them to do so, which is funny to think that one low-effort Wii game would throw the entire franchise into a tailspin for over a decade. I've already covered there was a small gap in the first year and a half of the Wii's life where other racing games got a chance to shine before Mario Kart pissed all over the competition in mid-2008. The DS was nowhere near as lucky though, with Mario Kart DS releasing in 2005, setting the bar high pretty early. This means that games like Diddy Kong Racing DS are immediately at a disadvantage, and constant targets for comparison. That's not to say it didn't do all that it could to stand out, with a full adventure mode letting you explore a hub in your kart and both flying and on-water modes years before Mario or Sonic would try it in their spin-offs. It's actually even further ahead of its time since this is actually a port of the N64 original, with some important tweaks made to avoid characters who had been acquired by different companies appearing on a console that they're now legally separated from. This means that they were able to add a bunch of DS-specific modes, features and minigames, some which worked while others just felt gimmicky, like touchscreen controls weren't something anyone wanted for a racing game. It feels like a lot was being done to make this game stand out from the Plumbers racing endeavours both in the N64 original and even more so with the DS version. However, with all the extras, it fails to establish a strong foundation. The worst example of this is the tracks. There are some which had a couple noticeable landmarks, but from the ones which I played, they all kind of blended together. Not to constantly make the comparison, but I haven't picked up Mario Kart DS in years, but I could still remember the layout of Waluigi Pinball, Delfino Plaza, and the various incarnations of Bowser's Castle and Rainbow Road. And even though I played it just hours before writing the script, you could put a gun to my head and ask me to name any track from Diddy Kong Racing, and I'd tell you to shoot and just save us all some time. It's an unfair comparison though, since back with the DS, Mario Kart was already an established franchise, with this being its 5th entry, while for Donkey Kong's nephew, this was already his last chance, and it was only a remake of the first game, making it feel dated even back in 2007. If Nintendo are feeling generous, maybe they could let Diddy Kong Racing have a real second chance on their next console before they release the next Mario Kart. But since even Donkey Kong himself hasn't had a new game in a decade now, I definitely don't see Diddy getting that lucky. Square Enix's effort of popularising the Mana series in 2007 didn't just end with Children of Mana, there was also Heroes of Mana, and unfortunately it didn't do much better. Square were really trying to make RTS games happen on the DS, just like with Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, this is a Mana series trying real-time strategy. In spite of being excited for Heroes of Mana before it released, O&M ended up having a pretty good summary of what's wrong with the game by the time they reviewed it.
Too convoluted and generally annoying to be any real fun. It's a competent effort, but there are genuinely better attempts at the genre on the way if you can wait.
The problem is, there's really no reason to play Heroes of Mana. It's not a particularly interesting RTS, and the fact that it uses stylus controls means it's also tricky to play. It's not got that interesting of a story, and unless you're a die-hard Mana fan, which not many people were at the time since the series didn't really have much good going on, there's not much appeal. At least with Revenant Wings, there was the appeal to fans of Final Fantasy XII, which had only come out the year before, but Heroes of Mana doesn't have that. Some people retain fondness for it since it got them into real-time strategy games, and I imagine there's probably a handful of people who share this opinion thanks to just how popular the DS was. But for people going back and actually playing it, they don't tend to be that forgiving, with a scathing 2.4 average on Backlogged. At least the Mana series is back on track now, but this era nearly ended the franchise. When I saw that the O&M Games of 2007 feature had 2 flight sim games, I gave myself the goal to play at least one of them, since I knew I probably wasn't going to be a big fan of either. So I chose Blazing Angels, but now with the power of hindsight I wish I chose Heatseeker instead. That's not to say it looks like a great game by any means, but it at least looks like it's having more fun. It's brighter, it's not obsessed with World War II, and it has an impact cam so you can watch your enemies blow up as it happens. Most of the reviews weren't that forgiving, most saying that the dogfighting is forgivable, but the rest is a scrapped together corny mess. In fact, the most positive review I could actually find was from O&M themselves when they got their hands on it.
Exactly the sort of game that should ensure the Wii continues to thrive. It's easy to get used to, has a perfect difficulty curve, and is pure fun throughout. An explosive success.
Turns out though, they were just about the only people that thought Heatseeker was an explosive success. It's faded into obscurity by now, and if you're after a flight sim game, there are plenty better that you can access for free, let alone dusting off your Wii and tracking down a copy of this. However, if you're looking for comedically bad voice acting, then maybe you can find some value here.
Further reports today that the International Council is, quote, extremely troubled by the Federation's refusal to back down over oil drilling rights.
After falling in love with Katamari thanks to the Switch ports, it's pretty hard to actively look for a game like Katamari since it's pretty much its own thing. However, it feels like Elebits for the Wii fills that same void. Elebits, or as it's known in Europe, LEDs, tasks you with using a capture gun to rifle through different rooms to track down small electrical creatures, the eponymous LEDs, to bring power back to your living space and also power up your gun. The more of them you collect, the heavier objects you can move and the more appliances you can turn on to forcefully evacuate the tiny creatures living inside them. This means the further you get into the level, the more destructive you can be, throwing cabinets and desks around, letting you fulfill the fantasy of being able to literally turn your house upside down when you've lost something. What's most impressive though is that this game takes full advantage of the Wii's strengths. Even the Wii games I'd return to that have implemented motion controls well, I would usually prefer a standard layout and feel like they were just working within the strange limitations imposed by the Wii remote. But LEDs wouldn't work as well with any other controller. It's not perfect, but being able to throw around everything yourself with what's essentially just fancy pointer controls feels responsive and satisfying. It was even the first game to take full advantage of the Wii's online functionality, with the developers Konami beating Nintendo to the punch with the option to share screenshots and your own level creations, because of course it lets you make your own levels. The main critique for this game was that the level designs were a bit bland, which when I hear I can understand, but honestly I was just impressed with how much of the level I could tear apart, and how much fun I was having doing it, and any visual complaints are immediately offset by the stupid designs of the LEDs themselves, which I believe are perfect and beyond any form of criticism inherently. If I was in a different tax bracket I would have already purchased a handful of plushies that were released back in 2007, but a boy can dream. The only real issue comes with the game's sporadically relevant story and the fact that it has some absolutely atrocious voice acting. But truly, when voice acting is this bad, I think it loops back around and becomes a plus in itself. If any game is worth plugging your Wii back in for, it's this, and with how cheap you can find it, it's well worth the price of entry.
Just one more story. I promise I'll go to sleep after that.
To put into perspective just why Metroid fans are so rabid for Metroid Prime 4, which should be releasing in 2025, thoughts and prayers, is that the most recent entry, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, came out in 2007. This game will probably turn 18 before it's finally no longer the latest Metroid Prime game. All the way back when it was released, Metroid Prime 3 was praised as being the best in the series so far and a fantastic end to what was then a trilogy. It looked better than the first two and took full advantage of the Wii's pointer for responsive shooting. This control scheme was so popular that the first two were ported over to the Wii and given the same control style as part of the Metroid Prime Trilogy collection. In spite of the massive success it launched to, while Metroid Prime 3 is still loved as part of the trilogy, now the water's settled, it's seen as the worst of the three, at least if we go by review aggregators and general opinion. But I'm sure that individual fans have their specific rankings. Worst is a strong word, of course, it's less worst and more least fantastic of the three. Still fantastic, but not as much as the others. I spent quite a bit of time trying to work out why people tend to put 3 as their lowest pick, and it doesn't help that no one can seem to agree why. Perhaps it's a combination of nitpicks like being more linear, a little easier, or the atmosphere not being as strong, which culminate in it slipping below the other two. I'm detaching my opinion here because shamefully I haven't completed the trilogy yet, and since I have the whole trilogy on the Wii U of all places, I really don't have an excuse. But with 4 hopefully being out next year, I think I'm going to use that as my motivation to finally get through all 3 and come to my own conclusions. Even so, Prime 3 was a massive asset for the Wii's 2007 lineup, and hopefully 4 will do the same for Nintendo's 2025 lineup too. In essence, video games are supposed to be pure recreational fun, and it's a shame that so much of the discussion around them can be negative and reactionary. And also, I think it's sad that people are so willing to dismiss some games and even entire genres as bad without giving them a chance. Saying all that, you couldn't pay me to care about the Mario vs Donkey Kong series. Puzzle, strategy, logic games like this never feel like they're satisfying or rewarding enough to justify the effort that goes into playing them, and while I can enjoy some, it feels like the way they're done with Mario vs Donkey Kong is just the blandest execution possible, and while the original might have had something, choosing to take out the element of active control from the original for a fully automated approach to the titular marching minis feels like a misguided design choice that actively detracts from what made the original enjoyable to its intended audience. I went out of my way to pick this DS game up with the hopes that it would prove me wrong, but as soon as I got into the levels, I could feel every second of effort I was putting into trying to enjoy myself, grinding down my willpower and just having the inverse effect. If you want to start liking games like this, Mario vs Donkey Kong 2 will not be an effective conversion therapy. Following up something as interesting as Metroid Prime 3, it's a little bit of a downer to finish with something as safe as this. Like, sure, they saved a first-party Nintendo release for the end, but they also know that if anything will lose interest and get people to put a magazine down, it's having to read semi-enthusiastic hype for March of the fucking Minis. I feel someone at Nintendo with some sort of influence must really love this idea because it does keep coming back, but never to much fanfare. After this, the series went digital only, before that was cool and more just a sign that budget was being constrained. And even now, while the remake of the original I'm sure made the masochistic fans of the series happy, I don't think it had that much of an impact. For people who enjoy these games, I applaud you for your patience, but I don't think I'm going to put myself through trying to be one of you again. So after 28 Wii games, 21 DS, and a sneaky one on the GBA, that's what Nintendo was supposedly lined up for in 2007. My initial intention was to assess how much Nintendo owned the year by using this feature to see what the expectations were, and then using the power of being 17 years in the future to see if they were on the money. However, my main takeaway has been more of a look back on how much the industry has changed. For a quick answer to my original question though, of course Nintendo owned 2007. The Wii and the DS are two of the most successful consoles of all time, and having them both be in their prime is an obviously strong foundation. Then to have a year when the home console has a new 3D Mario and the handheld has a new generation of Pokemon, Nintendo didn't really need anything more than that for this to be a good year. But of course they also had Phantom Hourglass for the DS and Metroid Prime 3 for the Wii as slightly more niche but still big hitters too. And while they aren't all massive games like the ones I just mentioned, a lot of smaller but high quality titles came out frequently enough to strengthen the growing libraries of both consoles, but especially the DS. Even though there are a handful of smash hits predicted in this feature, there were just as many disappointments. Reading it, I could see that a lot of these games they were excited for wouldn't be anything special. Of course, I have the power of hindsight, so that's not really impressive, but even so, I think they were just more optimistic. There are plenty of signs of official Nintendo magazine's age, even if it's just in this specific issue, whether it's a free Wii carry bag you get for subscribing, or the photos of the team posing for each of the reviews. but what's even more striking is just how not jaded they are in their writing. Of course, the positive attitude likely comes as this being an obviously great time for Nintendo fans, and it's before the massive struggle bus that would be the Wii U era, but it's just funny to see their biggest worries are if the Wii and DS are seen as kiddie gimmick consoles, and getting annoyed if new game entries are too derivative of what came before. To briefly give that second point a bit more attention, I think the reason why we don't care too much about new entries reinventing the wheel every time is because game development has become so much more time consuming and expensive than it was 17 years ago. A new entry in a series usually takes so long to come out that by the time we have it in our hands, the previous entry is usually a distant memory, and the new entry will of course feel different enough because it's probably been a couple of console generations since the last one. The reason why we only really get bold experiments from indie studios is because making a full AAA or even AA game is such an investment that it needs to be a guaranteed hit, or otherwise it'll likely be the end for that studio. These things still happened back in 2007, but they weren't as pervasive or common. The Megaman Battle Network series had 6 entries released on the same console between 2001 and 2005, and that just wouldn't have happened if it was between 2021 and 2025, because it's all just so much more expensive, because there's so much more pressure on the industry, and by extension gamers too. I'll stop myself because it's easy to let this conversation devolve into a big nostalgia-fueled gaming isn't fun now and I miss a good old days self-pleasure session, because that's just not true. In 2007 the gaming industry was still in this awkward adolescence where everything was still being thrown at the wall to see what sticks. There were some gems, but just as many failed attempts. With where we are now, gaming's reached adulthood, and that means a more consistent standard of quality because developers know what they're doing. I miss instruction manuals too, but part of the reason why they're not needed anymore is because 90% of games control the same. But with this maturity comes adult problems. We know too much about the horrors of game development and crunch. It feels like every other big game is a 3D, maybe open world action RPG, it just feels like more of an industry. Even so, when I think about my favourite games of all time, while my favourite released in 2012, most of them are from the last generation or two. Official Nintendo magazine released its last issue in 2014, and the main reason cited is that Nintendo Directs were proving successful. I enjoy Nintendo Directs as much as the next person, but having an official Nintendo magazine provided a more personal touch that I can't say I don't miss. Gaming is at its core about fun, and it still is, and I hope it always will be. Reading this magazine I felt that, and while a Nintendo Direct is a much more efficient method of driving hype, especially when we consider social media, it sometimes feels like I'm at a shareholder meeting being given the news on whether my Switch was a worthwhile investment. That's dramatic, but I hope you get what I'm going for. The funny thing is, there still is, technically speaking, an official Nintendo magazine. While it's only physically released in Japan, you can read digital translated copies online, and they look amazing. Even though it's only about 50 pages per issue, you can tell care has been put into making each of the spreads look fantastic, and the cover art is nearly always made specially for the issue. Bowser is our current cover boy, and if that won't tempt me to read, I don't know what will. You'll get some sweet extra details about Nintendo's newest games, and if you're lucky they'll reference third-party or indie games in passing, but in essence it's a really high-effort ad. That's not to say that official Nintendo magazine of yore wasn't overly positive, because it definitely was, but at least there was something to dig into and they were clearly given permission to be critical, and when you look at the new incarnation you can see that's never going to happen there. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy it exists, but it doesn't fill that same void. Who knows, maybe I just need to expand my horizons. That was less of a conclusion and more a series of observations. Keep an eye out for my follow-up video in 2041 where I talk about how the industry has changed in the last 17 years, again, but until then let me know what you think, since I'm pretty sure most people who've got this far will have opinions.
1, 2, 3.
Thanks for making it to the end. This is a pretty long one, but I had a lot of fun making it. If you like this, subscribing would be amazing, especially since my next video will be in a pretty similar style, only ranking everything I've played this year. I've played way too much, so I'm looking forward to talking about all of them. But if you really want to hear me talk about games more right now, then my ranking from last year should keep you busy for a while. But honestly, I had a great time putting this together. I got the idea essentially as soon as I saw the magazine, and having a source to center everything around was a nice change of pace. Also, discovering games like Elebits, finally giving myself an excuse to pick up Hotel Dusk and Mario Strikers, and even going back to Elite Beat Agents and actually beating it this time. It all almost made Blazing Angels and March of the Minis worth playing. I'd love the chance to talk about any of these games more, whether you agreed or disagreed with me, or if there's a favourite game from 2007 that wasn't featured, or something you just love about this console generation. Let me know in the comments. And thanks to Jay for helping me with the quotes per usual. It's nice to have some brief breaks from my own voice, and he did a great job as always. But as I said, I'll be back soon with my 2024 ranking next month if everything goes to plan, so see you there hopefully.